Welcome to part 2 of the exploration of the Baroque era. We ended part 1 by looking at this painting by the artist Caravaggio. He left so many masterworks behind, and yet he died at the age of 37 after getting in a sword fight and suffering a wound which ultimately took his life. Another artist that was influenced by him would be the artist Artemisia Gentileschi. As we've been exploring the art of the Renaissance and the Baroque era, maybe some of you have been asking, where are the women? Well, here's one of them. She was a very extraordinary person whose life reflected some of the challenges faced by women artists in particular of the time. Her father was an artist, and he hired a young painter to be her tutor. This younger painter tutor actually raped Artemisia Gentileschi, and when her father found out, he pressed charges. As a result, it was really Artemisia who was put on trial, not so much the man who had raped her. In humiliation, she ended up leaving Rome and settling in Florence, where she became the first woman to be invited to be in the Painters Guild. Throughout her life, much of the work of Artemisia Gentileschi reflects some kind of anger at, or it appears to reflect an anger at what happened to her. When I saw her work in person, there's a gallery with several of her pieces, and they're all actually quite violent, as the one we see here, although not everything that she painted was violent. Here we have a self-portrait on the right, which is really unusual for its time. Most self-portraits have the artist staring directly at the viewer or holding a more conventional pose, and here she's looking away from the viewer at what she's painting. And if you unpack it a little bit and think about how an artist would do this without the use of photography, it's a really unusual painting. The one on the left is a recently discovered work of hers. Now let's revisit the work of an artist that we met in our very first slide, because when you look at this work, it really has more of a modern feel with the photorealistic quality and the fact that it's a cantaloupe. This artist is Juan Coton, and with his work we're moving from Italy to Spain. One of the things that I really find intriguing about this artist's work is the fact that he would paint things that were so ephemeral. The cantaloupe, you put it on the windowsill for maybe an hour and it would start to lose color and draw flies and all the rest of that. And yet he captured it with an oil painting that would be painted in many sessions over many days. Also, the way that he hung his fruit and vegetables is really innovative. It makes me think of modern art, actually. Now, another Spanish painter of great renown is the artist Velázquez. Diego Velázquez became the court painter, but in his early days he established his reputation by painting such great masterpieces as the Water Bear here on the right. He painted this when he was just 20 years old. Honestly, this is one of my favorite paintings also. I guess I have a lot of them, but in this case, check out the delicate way that he painted the vase. Also, look at the way the light is shining on this glass. What this painting depicts is a man who's selling cold water on the streets of Seville, Spain, which could get quite hot in the summertime. This painting, Las Meninas, is really considered his masterwork, and he painted this one about 30 years later. He went on to be a darling of the court of Charles IV, and here in this painting, you might look at it at first and think, oh, okay, so it's a painting, so what? Let's take it a little bit more close. Let's look a little more closely. Here is the artist who's looking at the painting, and here we have a young princess with all of her courtiers around. But in addition to that, there's the dog, and these are her favorite dwarfs. In the background, in the mirror, is the king and the queen, and here we have a servant. So there's so much going on here, and yet it all sort of seems to be caught in a snapshot. If you can see, the little boy or dwarf is playing with the dog. The dog looks a little grumpy, etc., etc. And the one figure who's looking out is the artist himself. So this is a much analyzed painting that's really considered one of the masterpieces of the Baroque era. And Velázquez really stands out as being a master painter of the time. So let's move on and let's go all the way to Mexico. In Mexico City, the cathedral was built during this same era. And while we'll spend most of our time in Europe this semester, we're going to pop over to the quote New World because the story of this cathedral is both heartbreaking and in some ways interesting. It was built on the site of Teotihuacan, which was the most important Aztec city that had just been conquered by Cortez. Not only that, the site of the cathedral is right on the most important temple for the Aztec people, and they actually used stones from that temple to build the cathedral. Now we're going to move on from Mexico and go back to Northern Europe and talk about Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens is one of the most famous artists of the era. A lot of people talk about a Rubenesque woman being someone who's very shapely. This particular painting shows his tendency for high drama. Now, this artist was so well known and his works were so sought after that he had to have a large workshop in order to fulfill his commissions. Generally, Rubens would paint the faces, and then those artists working for him would do the scenes around, the less central figures. This painting on the left is fascinating to me because it was commissioned by this woman here. That would be Marie de Medici. And she was the regent to the young boy king of France. So she commissioned 21 paintings painted over a series of 2 years that put her at the center of many historical allegories. This particular one shows Marie de Medici arriving at Marseille. And check it out. There's the courtier here with the symbols of France bowing down before her. There's angels playing trumpets overhead. There's all sorts of people greeting her. And this looks like gods and goddesses below holding up her platform. Now, the goddesses are a great example of what we call the Rubenesque form. But I find this fascinating in that it is so over the top, and it really is an example of some of the excesses that later led to the French Revolution, really. So now that we've looked at how the nobility are living, let's look at food again, shall we? Here we have another of those still life paintings that you think, how did they do that? Because these are all things that would spoil quickly, and they're arranged in a pretty non-traditional manner. They look somehow contemporary, even though they were done about 400 years ago. This is by the artist Clara Peters, who's another of the women who made a name for herself during the Baroque era. One of the things about women painters is that still lifes were generally acceptable for them to paint, although some women artists did break out of that convention. One artist who did that was Judith Leyster, and she studied under this guy, Frans Hals. He was a painter in the Netherlands during the 1600s. What I'd most invite you to notice here is how Hals is moving away from the very tight style that we see with Rubens and with so many of the painters that have come before. With Hals, we see brushstrokes beginning to loosen up, and he also focused on the common people, providing us with a glimpse of what the rest of the world lived like during that time. His student, Judith Leyster, became really well known in her own right until she married and had children, and then she pretty much disappeared. But here in the portrait on the left, she's depicted herself as a noblewoman and as an artist. Now, I would never paint in those clothes, but she's getting her point across. Ah, and what about Rembrandt? He was another Dutch artist and one of the most widely known. Rembrandt is best known for his series of self-portraits and his dramatic use of light and dark. He took the use of shadow and light to a whole new level, as we see here in this painting of Titus, his son. Rembrandt's life was actually pretty tragic. He lost his true love, his first wife. They lost several children. He lost his second wife and also the one son that made it to adulthood was Titus, and he died before the artist did. So he pretty much died alone. Many of Rembrandt's paintings, like his self-portraits or one called The Night Watchman, are very well known. So we're looking at a few of his lesser-known works that show his great skill. In addition to being a painter, Rembrandt was also a draftsman and a printmaker. He was a very well-rounded artist, but he didn't really handle money so well. So he had a lot of trouble in his life, although we are left with just a huge quantity of great masterworks. Now let's take a look at another Dutch artist, and that would be Johannes Vermeer. Vermeer's paintings really differ from those of, say, Frans Hals and Judith Leister in that they're very tightly painted, almost photographic. In fact, this artist used the camera obscura, which was an early version of the camera, in order to lay out his scenes. It was a contraption with mirrors and a box that would project a scene upside down on the artist's canvas. When we look at how he used the perspective of the floors and how really careful his scenes are depicted, it's easy to imagine that he used the grandfather of the camera, really, to do his work. One characteristic of most of Vermeer's paintings, and there are really not very many, I think 32 have survived. One characteristic of these paintings is that they're almost all in a home, a domestic scene. Here is an example that is an exception to that. And this would be, it looks like an allegory from history of a woman having her feet washed. And it's striking in that it is something different from what we typically see with this artist. Oh, and what of Louis XIV? Before we go any further, I've got to talk about legs. I mean, check out this guy's legs. This portrait was painted when he was 65, and he was actually quite proud of his legs. So who invented the high heel? It was this guy. He needed to have the extra height in order to show off his legs to greatest effect. And so he's really the first person that we know that wore high heels in history. So we have him to thank for that. He was an interesting ruler in that he really believed that he was ruling by divine decree. In other words, God had made him the ruler, and by God, he was going to rule as he wanted to. So he did all sorts of things to control the populace. One interesting thing that he did with the nobility was he gathered them all at the great palace of Versailles. So he required them all to live close by so he could keep an eye on things. So there wasn't going to be a plot against him hatched in a distant location because they were all right there. He also kept up almost constant entertainment and palace intrigue to keep the courtesans engaged. He called himself the Sun King, which was a rather noble title for a king. He was also the preeminent art collector of his era. And where did he live? Oh, this little shack. This is the Palace of Versailles. It's almost a quarter-mile long, and it was built on the site of an old hunting lodge. But he wanted to make a symbol of his great power, and he also needed to have a place to house all of the courtesans. In addition to the palace, there's a huge hand-dug moat. There's also a man-made cave called the Grotto, and he made a small city nearby where all of the workers could live. Within Versailles, one of the greatest rooms is seen to be this hall of mirrors. So It's over 240 feet long. That would be almost as long as a football field, to put it in perspective. And it has hundreds of mirrors along each wall. At the time that it was built, a mirror was a very exotic thing. So it just made it even more over the top. The excesses that went into the building of Versailles really came back later, about 100 years later, with the French Revolution that overthrew the monarchy and really uh, was an end to this gross excess of the French aristocracy. Now let's go from him to the common people again. How did the rest of the people live? We have the nobility and the king who lived a certain way, but then most of the citizens of France were highly taxed and not living that royal, regal life. There were two brothers, the Lenain brothers, and this is Louis Lenain's work called The Artist's Studio. He was a master at depicting everyday life, and I really like his work. Again, let's look at how he is using light and shadow and how he set up this composition to guide our eye through it. We have the woman playing lute, who is the focal point, but right straight down is the dog, which is also kind of combined with her in a focal point. The artist himself is a secondary form, right here, a little bit more difficult to see. The placement of the easel and the way it goes through that figure in the background, probably his brother, all serve to create a really strong composition. One of Lenain's most famous works is called The Family of Country People. And this was created at a time when the common people were really struggling. There was the 30 Years' War, which engaged most of the countries in Europe during this time, and it meant that the common people were really suffering. Yet what he did was he showed the common folk with a real sense of nobility. One thing I really like about this is the little dog and the little cat, because it brings a level of domesticity to that maybe we can relate to this day. So to wrap up our exploration of the Baroque era, let's go from the common people of Lenain and Leicester and Hals back to the grandiosity of a ceiling painting, because this really symbolizes the great contradictions of the Baroque time. Also, it shows the underlying issues that were going to explode, about 100 years, 75 to 100 years later, with the French Revolution, when the lower classes who had been taxed and not considered rose up against the monarchy, and things changed quite radically. So with this, that brings our exploration of the Baroque time to a close. And as always, thank you so much for listening.